Well, my next guest was interviewed about these allegations of Israeli war crimes on the BBC over the weekend.
Every strike that Israel takes, every military action is weighed up, it is analysed to make sure that according to international law, the anticipated collateral damage, the harm to civilians, is proportionate to the military aims of a strike that is militarily necessary and legitimately targets terrorist infrastructure. So these suggestions of collective punishment are morally reprehensible, liable.
I'm joined now by Natasha Hausdorff, international lawyer and barrister. Natasha, thank you for coming in. One of the key things you discussed was the question of collective punishment. How would you define collective punishment, and what is it lawful for a state to do and what is it not lawful for a state to do?
Well, this is a term we've been hearing deployed frequently, and it's inextricably linked with the same false allegations of war crimes, which were even repeated in the chamber in Parliament this afternoon. It is that sort of misrepresentation of the facts before we even get to the law, which I think is at the heart of so much of the vitriol that we have been seeing pouring out against Israel, as you have already been covering, even on the streets of the UK. But the misrepresentations of international law go to the issue of proportionality that I addressed in that clip you've just played, and the sickening equivalence which is suggested of comparing casualty figures on both sides. It's misrepresentations like that that serve to cloud the issue and hoodwink people so that they don't properly understand what is it Israel is required to do under the laws of armed conflict. And importantly, they are fooled into thinking that Israel is in fact breaking international law.
So what is Israel allowed to do? There have been considerable concerns, for example, about water not being supplied to Gaza. Is it legitimate to cut off water when you are facing a terrorist attack from a particular territory?
The starting point is that Israel isn't required under international law to supply anything. Certainly not to Hamas, who is striving, even in the course of your broadcast, there have been continued rocket fire onto Israeli civilians. And there is no international legal requirement for Israel to provide anything to Gaza. The only provision under Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention is to facilitate the supply of aid and supplies by third parties if they are not going to be diverted to Hamas. Now, some of your previous contributors have talked about Hamas's violent control over the Gaza Strip after they violently seized control in 2007. That is not a question as to whether or not Hamas will seize the supplies that are now being let in through the Rafah crossing. Israel has committed to continue that supply of humanitarian aid, even in these circumstances, even though it doesn't have an obligation under international law to do so. It's going above and beyond its requirements.
And this is very difficult for a democratic state because it could be, in legal terms, much more brutal than it is actually wise to be. Is that fair?
It's not only that, and if I can supplement your introduction, there's also a positive obligation, not just on Israel, but all states parties to the Convention on Genocide, for Israel to take a very robust response here. But as in previous operations, and this has been well documented and commented on by legal and military experts, Israel has always strived to ensure the minimal civilian collateral damage. The warnings that it issues to civilians through text messages in previous operations and phone calls to individual householders, the process of knock on roof, a final warning to any civilians in a building before it's struck. All of those processes that, in fact, Israel has championed, which many armies don't follow, even Western, liberal, democratic, human rights protecting armies. And that is the reality, which is so far from the libels that we have been hearing. And allegations of war crimes are extremely easy to make. They are extremely difficult to unpick because the factual circumstances are being so badly misrepresented. As
we found when Israel was accused of bombing the hospital, which Rishi Sunak confirmed in the House of Commons earlier on, now looks almost certain to have been a Hamas faulty rocket anyway.
And sadly, that's nothing new, because, of course, you'll recall that 2 days before that, Israel was also accused of striking a humanitarian convoy after having encouraged civilians to leave to the south of Gaza, where it is safer. Subsequently, that's also been revealed to have been a Hamas bombing fleeing civilians. But the combination of the false factual reporting and the blatant misrepresentations and abuses of international law create this sort of perfect storm.
One thing I'm interested in is how you differentiate between a siege which is legitimate and collective punishment which isn't. Is there a clear legal definition of the two?
It comes down to the intention. So the starvation of civilians, if a siege is implemented for that reason, it's plainly illegitimate, unlawful. But Israel's aims here have been clear and repeatedly stated: to get rid of Hamas, change the status quo in the Gaza Strip, so this terrorist organisation or any of the others that crossed the border on the 7th of October, because we must remember it was not just Hamas. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP and Fatah members also crossed over. So to change the reality of the situation in Gaza, which is for the benefit, as you were hearing earlier, of ordinary Palestinians living in Gaza, as well as the Israelis that are being subject to this appalling slaughter, butchery and torture.
That's the key thing to remember. It is the most appalling and wicked slaughter. Thank you so much for clarifying the complex international legal issues for us.